I get up, I get my daughter ready for school. After dropping her off, I head to work and busy myself with lecture prep, grading, and the constant parade of meetings that could have been emails. I then fight traffic to get home to spend some time with my son before putting him to bed. I then go to bed and do the same thing over and over again. 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 Welcome to Back to the Text Themselves, a series on phenomenology. Today's video examines Chapter 6, Sections 39 and 40 of Heidegger's Being and Time. In Chapter 5, we consider Dasein and its everydayness as it gets entangled in an inauthentic mode of existence. Despite serving as the ordinary manner of our being in the world, this fallenness hides from Dasein that world in its possibility. Nonetheless, through attunement, understanding, and discourse, we can discover another mode of being in the world whereby our facticity discloses to us our possibilities. In this video, I'll address the following questions. 1. What concept discloses the structural whole of Dasein? 2. What does Angst flee toward? And 3. What are the nothing and the uncanny? In section 39 of chapter 6, the question Heidegger poses to us concerns the ontological unity that connects our facticity to our existentiality, and thus to our possibilities. Specifically, Heidegger asks, is there a mode of attunement and understanding that allows us to gain access to the fundamental ontological problem, which is the question of the meaning of being in general? As we cannot get to the ontological by fiat, we had to first pass through the pre-ontological consideration of Dasein in its everydayness, which was accomplished in the previous chapters. In passing through it, we discovered one phenomenon above the rest that provides the key for considering the structural whole that links facticity and existentiality, and that is care. And so chapter 6 will more closely consider care in its disclosing to us this structural whole that makes accessible the fundamental ontological problem. Until now, we've had to concern ourselves with the various manners by which Dasein is in the world. However, the question now addressed in chapter 6 pertains to that which unifies all of these analyses. And so instead of asking what it means to be in the world or what it means to be with others, we're asking the question of what it means to be in general. And thus, since the question of being always passes through Dasein, we're also asking what does it mean for Dasein to be Dasein. Without a unifying concept, we would lack the means to link everyday Dasein to its ontological ground that makes this everydayness possible. As much as we become enamored by the individual analyses themselves, readiness to hand, the they, fallenness, etc., for Heidegger, they serve merely a preparatory role for what is the central purpose of this book, which is to establish the ontological foundation for Dasein's existence. One pivotal mood for accessing care is Angst, which is a mode of attunement that discloses Dasein not merely in its everydayness, but how in its facticity, Dasein may come to understand the meaning of its being. The term Angst may be translated as dread or anxiety. However, since the German word is sometimes left untranslated and doing so helps mitigate the temptation to understand the concept psychologically, I'm going to also leave the word untranslated. Angst is marked by a kind of flight. But to understand what angst is fleeing from, we must first understand what it is fleeing toward, which sheds light upon the threatening character that provoked such flight in the first place. In angst, Dasein flees toward its entangled absorption in the they and the surrounding world. Herein, Dasein assumes interpretations given to it by others. It doesn't question what it receives, and consequently, the world in its uncertain potentiality is covered over in favor of the familiarity of public interpretations received by these others. Fear is in response to a threatening innerworldly being that draws near to us. And so unlike fear, the flight of angst is not a turning away from innerworldly beings, but a turning toward them, a flight that is at the same time a falling prey. In our flight, that's due to angst, we get entangled in the everydayness of our being in the world with others that allows us to dwell in the familiarity and safety of the surrounding world, a being at home in the world. But if we're not turning away from innerworldly beings, what is Dasein fleeing from? The answer to this is already there in Heidegger's description of fallenness. Angst is a turning away from the indefiniteness of being itself, and more specifically, the being of Dasein. It's a flight from a world in which the there and innerworldly beings loses their meaningfulness. These innerworldly beings become meaningful to us only in a surrounding world that provides a totality of relevance. An integral dimension of that totality is our being with others who, as the they, furnish for us a particular understanding of these beings. Though making these beings meaningful to us, it also closes off other possibilities for Dasein, and so it alienates us from ourselves. And yet without it, we would confront the world in its incomprehensibility, which is a dimension of what Dasein is actually fleeing from in its angst. Having what is called an existential crisis may help to illustrate this point, though I'm not sure Heidegger would approve of it since it's often understood in a psychological manner. An existential crisis involves a situation whereby everything previously important to us loses its significance. We find ourselves floating in the meaninglessness of life, which evokes this sense of angst. This angst is not about any specific being, but about life in its totality as we struggle to find a purpose for ourselves within it. In this sense, we can say that what is threatening is the nothing. This nothing points toward the fact that angst does not concern itself with a particular region of the world, nor with anything in the world, but instead with the world itself. The nothing is not about beings no longer existing, but rather they're losing their significance before the incomprehensibility of the worldliness of the world. Now, there will be an important connection here between nothingness and death, but we'll be addressing that in a later video. Furthermore, because Dasein essentially belongs to the world as a being in the world, this flight constitutes as well a flight from oneself. Here, in the anxious flight from itself, we begin to discover what makes Dasein what it is in its authentic potentiality for being, which has been covered over in the sedating absorption of our entanglements. Angst delivers to Dasein its individuality. This is in contrast with the anonymity of the they. Angst discloses Dasein to itself in its individuation as a being with possibilities, free to choose and grasp itself in being toward its potentiality. A quick note here now, the individuality or individuation that's being discussed here is not a kind of individualism. Heidegger is seeking to be far removed from the ego and the concept of the subject, a subject that is somehow independent from and in a certain sense precedes the world, as one may interpret the Cartesian cogito. Dasein remains in the world and with others in its individuality. Our thrownness and facticity deliver to us latent possibilities that we may appropriate or forego. So if Dasein receives its individuality, it's only in and through its relation to the world and its relation to others in the world that have always already preceded it. Now, the tranquility of our everyday entanglement in the the world delivers a sense of being at home, as I've suggested already. To feel at home is to be unburdened by the weight of angst. Yet, upon confronting it, we are extracted from this entanglement as our everyday familiarity collapses. One is confronted with the peculiar indefiniteness of the nothing and the nowhere, giving rise to an uncanniness whereby we experience our not being at home. The uncanny is also a mode of attunement that's very close to anxiety or angst that confronts Dasein with its own thrownness in its existentially uncomprehended mode. The uncanny isn't what is completely foreign to us, but rather is the encounter with something familiar but in an unfamiliar manner, giving rise to the unnerving sensation of ambivalence and ambiguity that we might think of when, say, confronting a humanoid-like object such as a doll or mannequin. In contrast to those examples, Heidegger's notion of the uncanny is not directed toward anything in particular, but to the whole of our existence, which was previously meaningful but no longer is. Heidegger concludes section 40 claiming that angst and uncanniness are existentially and ontologically primordial, making possible fear and flight. First, to be afraid, which discloses the fearsome and threatening innerworldly being, is contingent upon a concern for the safety of one's being in general. Second, the temptation of flight into the they is first provoked by the angst and uncanniness of the unfamiliar possibilities already there in the ground of my being. And so we can see a connection now being made between the everydayness of our facticity and the authentic possibilities of our existentiality. And this link will continue to be developed in the next few sections. Now, Heidegger ends section 40 with an important question, which is that in the midst of this analysis of angst, how does it connect with care, and how does that in turn address the structural whole of Dasein in its being? And in the next video, we'll take up this question. I want to thank the following for supporting this channel on Patreon. If you wish to support this work on Patreon, the link is below in the description. You can also support this work by liking and sharing this video, as well as subscribing to my channel. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.